Well, we have today, let me begin saying, I always forget to say about what is this series about. There is a kind of definition that I want to read, and it's like this one. Innovation occurs on multiple scales, frequently crosses disciplines, and occasionally touches cities, lives, and culture. It's not a science, but requires design skills and must be informed by an eye for opportunity. This is a noontime talk series, which consists in a 20-25 minutes talk by our guest and followed by a discussion with faculty and students. Today we will have Neil Leeds and Luis Calleja responding, Nerea Calvillo, who will be the guest lecturer, and also the guest center, I don't see her, but she will be around probably. And Nerea, who is here with me, is an architect. She is a PhD. Months ago, she became a PhD in Madrid, in the School of Madrid. She studied in the same school I was a professor. And she has been teaching in other schools in Spain, like the European, the Alicante School, and also in Europe, like the Architectural Association. And she has become a researcher of the European project Citizen Sense, where this research has been made by her in collaboration with the Goldsmith University of London in the area of sociology. And she's, I would say she's specialized in visualization, can you see? Okay. And in trying to give a presence to things that supposedly are invisible. And she will, I have recommended her to, but I don't know what she's going to do. I have recommended her to focus in her design techniques as a warm-up session for what we will have the 30th of October in the Piper. That will be the first of a series of Harvard Symposium on Architecture. Also, some of the guests will be there, like Neil, and we'll focus on design techniques, an issue that many times we forget, but is crucial for all of us that love architecture. Now, Nerea, thank you for coming.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot, Iñaki, for the invitation. I think it's going to be super exciting to have all you guys here and to be able to explore and discuss the issues I'm going to propose. Thank you for the response and everybody who made the time and the space to be here. So thanks a lot. So this presentation, as Iñaki has mentioned, is going to bring together my research on the architectural and political implications of taking equality into account from a design perspective, and this challenge Iñaki on trying to connect it to the notion of design techniques. I have interpreted design techniques as ways of doing, as practices. And I have therefore selected some of the practices that I developed more or less consciously, alone or with other people, to answer this very, very specific question, which is how can we account for air quality in design? Which I became interested in some years ago, started with a visualization, as you're going to see, and ended up in a PhD. And I really hope that next question doesn't take this long. The practices that followed are not chronologically ordered, so you'll see that it's going to be like it was part of a pretty messy process in which thinking and making things was part of the same mode of thinking. And when doing things is when the most interesting moments of challenging what it meant, what I was doing, are raised. And then in the first intuition of just bringing the numbers from the city council and plugging them into a model, I realized, what does like 7 micrograms per cubic meter of nitrogen dioxide, mean? So how do we account for that? How do we use it? But why air quality as a starting point? So polluted air is homogenized in cities and contributing to materializing to what Rem Koolhaas has named generic city. It involves public health, but also industry, transportation, tourism, investments, or land price. But air pollution is a concept that is commonly flattened by averages, by very, very specific numbers, and lately has been used as a development or marketing strategy. There have been measures that have been implemented in the last 10 years which have tried to abate it in many different ways, as the definition of congestion belts or low emission areas, temporary measures like the artificially created rain in the Beijing Olympics, really crazy temporary measure that involved the military, etc. And also these kind of patches of tracks pouring glue to the streets that the Mayor of London tried to utilize to reduce the levels of the closest measuring stations. But I think these policies and all these measures have been articulated around emissions control and health risk, hoping to solve the problem, which is having clean air, through the development of technologies of the body, like calculating the effect of the air in certain organs, technologies of emission control, or technologies of detection. However, these measures have not been successfully managed to reduce the levels. And in principle, as this slide says, you reduce one level, but then the others, the level of one component, but the level of others raise. And in fact, I would want to claim that the possibility of having clean air is never again possible. Our environment is polluted, so let's see what we have to do with it. So my proposal is to try to deal with the environment in a way that moves away from efficiency and risk, and deal with a more ecosystemic approach, which is based in multiplicity, redundancy, and difference. So my first design technique has been to build up a context. When researching within architecture and urban history and theory to find an answer of what to do with air pollution, one encounters that since the 19th century, for example, there have been projects that have dealt with air quality, like Haussmann's opening of streets to increase ventilation, or the acquisition of parks as green lungs that took place in London in the mid-18th century. At a theoretical level, Reinhard Banham in 1969 wrote The Architecture of the Well-Tempered Environment, where he claimed that air has to be accounted and a necessary element of architecture, but he was talking specifically about interior air. Also, in architecture practices, there's been offices that have worked with the air as a toxic context, as a construction material, or as a hygienist tool, as for example the House of the Future, Peter Allison Smithson wanted to embody, which was like to generate a completely enclosed context wall and architecture device to be protected with the toxic exterior environment. But in order to think about the socio-technical, what I think is that there's a gap in all this history that doesn't account very specifically, back here, which doesn't take specifically about the materiality and the toxic capacities of the air. What has been called air pollution, air quality, etc. And I think there's a gap here for intense research, either in architecture, urban planning, and landscape design. That's, I think we're all interested part here. So, in order to think about the material capacities of the air, I have constructed a theoretical framework at the intersection of three intellectual landscapes that have been dealing with air quality. These intellectual landscapes are philosophy of culture, science and technology studies, and feminist studies of technoscience, having Peter Sloterdijk, Lucy Irigaray, Luna Latour, and Donna Haraway as my main interlocutors. Sloterdijk demonstrates how, for the First World War, the air is designed through devices, which, in a way, it helps us to think as the air as a technically enhanced and designed issue, and not necessarily as a metaphor or as or as a void, as has been used in architecture in many different contexts. Science and technology studies, for example, have provided the instrumental and analytical tools to engage with objects from a material perspective. And for me, feminist studies and queer theory have been the lens that enabled me to challenge notions of diversity, neutrality and objectivity of sciences and technology, and opening up the spectrum towards new materialisms where the modern human, the air in this case, play a fundamental role that enables us to move towards the more corporeal and the more subjective. Second, design technique. The construction of a socio-technical assemblage by the definition of aeropolis. Within this framework, the theoretical framework that I exposed before, there is not anymore particles and gases, but the spaces, institutions, humans, economies, etc., to which it's connected. To say it in other words, it is as a socio-technical assemblage. To analyze it, I have used a heuristic metaphor of the city, which I have named aeropolis for several reasons. The first one is avoiding the description of the whole network to look for the very specific moments and relations that are politically charged and that have very, very specific interrelationships among each other. So I identified the landscape, the market, or the representations of Madrid's aeropolis, which Madrid has been my case study city. The second reason for using a heuristic metaphor of the city is to specialize the notion of air quality. Moving away from numbers and averages, as we saw at the very beginning, what interests me is the relationship that the air has with the city and the urban space, and how they are a completely entangled interrelationship that varies within 5, 20, 100 meters according to the different component that we're looking for. And yet, I'd like to clarify that following William Mitchell, aeropolis is not a mere description, but a projectual and design exercise in itself. As Mitchell proposes in The City of Bits, and I quote, "If we understand what is happening, we can find opportunities to intervene, resist, organize, legislate, plan, and design." So it is not only a description of the state of the art, but aeropolis tries to be a proposal of what things can become. So welcome to Aeropolis. It is a space to think not only about the air, but from a cosmopolitical approach as the space to think in the air and with the air. It is not the space of the spectacle or the big event, but it is the space for the slow death, of what Laurent Berland has called slow death, of the invisible, and a time that happens in very, very, very long times, and where no cause effect can be traced. So in a way, it's a way of relating with the environment and looking from the air as what is its socio-technical assemblage, but then trying to think and negotiating with it how it wants to be represented in itself, how we want it to be represented as humans, and how we can enable more symmetrical relationships on how we think about it and how it's represented and designed, as we'll see in the next slides, maybe. Okay. The first attempt to think about Aeropolis is a project that I initiated in 2008, which was called In the Air, which I developed with collaborators in different contexts. It specializes official data, shifting the attention from the number itself, like how many micrograms per cubic meter that it exists at a very specific point, and tries to relate it in space and time with the rest of the city of Madrid. It also intends to make citizens experience and inhabit the data from a different perspective. So in a way, as you'll be able to see, one can decide where to locate oneself in relation to this pollution. So it's never again a top-up vision of what's happening, but it's a way of being able to even inhabit those data sets. And as you can see, all the ones that are turning red are the ones that exceed the limits regulated by the European Union. design strategy, looking and building, which is the important aspect, of sensing instruments, which I think are necessarily design tools. But let's see how this works. Within all possible agents of Aeropolis that could be researched, I have focused on its windows, infrastructures, and mediators, as the instruments that make the air sensible and measurable as the sensors, maps, which make it visible, and air quality indexes, which are the instruments that mediate between institutions and citizenship. They tell us how to interpret scientific data into more understandable, and all this is quotes and quotes, in an easier way for citizens. So one of the challenges of the project also has been to try to expand the different and to identify the different ways in which air quality was sensed in Madrid. So not only going for the scientific instruments, but also trying to identify in which other ways in the city there were practices, people, different environments that were making, constructing, thinking in other ways of engaging with air quality. And as we can see here, for example, in the sensors, we have the official ones. Here. DIY quality sensors that are part of an international network, but had a very important development in Madrid. And then expanding also the ways of sensing into other understandings of what a device can mean, which can be, for example, the human body, which by smelling, by the effects that it has in certain people, because they have a specific chemical sensitivity, we can understand that they provide other ways of sensing and measuring. There's also maps, but there's also air quality indexes that, as I explained, are very variable and political issues that unfortunately we don't have time to go here, but there are also ways of mediating between the air and humans. But let's take a look on how some specific instruments, sensors in this case, are transforming the urban space and are instruments to design it. The first one relates to the materiality of the sensing devices themselves. In response to the tropes of the smart cities and Internet of Things, where infrastructures are invisible translators of the air and mere infrastructures, what we can see is that although these sensors, and these are the ones of Madrid, have invisibilized and almost camouflaged, it's pretty interesting how they're really trying to merge them at so many different techniques into their own context. In fact, they have a materiality. But the thing is that the materiality has been distributed to all other contexts, so they're not anymore in the public space, but they have been distributed within interior spaces that relate to all these facilities, for example, of the city council. But also we can see that depending on where these devices have been measured, they incorporate public institutions, and we realize that their objectuality, like how they have been designed, matters and affects the way in which people engage with them, and also in the ways in which data can be mobilized. And one last issue would be, which I think is very interesting, is how these DIY sensors start inhabiting private spaces. So public infrastructures start inhabiting the private realms. In terms of how these maps or descriptions of the city affect and construct the air, literally, air conditions, we can see how, for example, they are used to define the emission zones, free emission zones in European areas at least, in which they define which areas are going to be accessible by traffic, they're going to have different meters for parking, etc., etc. In other types of models, for example, we see that it is not only what the model represents, but the decision of which internal model pockets that scientists have used that enable or disable different things. And for example, for one same research, scientists realized that by using different models, different mathematical models, the results on how to protect certain areas of Portugal would give completely different results. So from not being protected to being protected at all. So we can see how the decision of which model we are going to use is going to have enormous effects on how landscape is going to be protected. But also citizen practices and citizen engagement, which it's a long story, but in this case they managed, by monitoring air quality themselves, they managed to avoid the construction of a large supermarket next to that area. But something I'm very interested in is that if we open up the epistemic ways of if we open up the epistemic ways of knowing and legitimize other ways of knowing, such as bodies, as I spoke before, other aspects of relating to the city get into play. For example, the materiality of the public spaces, like the actual materials that we use that enable or disable people that have, for example, multi-chemical sensitivity. And last, it is relevant to notice that the normative implications of each device are very, very prominent in how we put them in the public. For example, the Sahara particles that move all along Europe, by framing them the Sahara particles and something foreign, all these racist movements get mobilized precisely by the way in which we are presenting all those data. So let's construct devices. Because by knowing the sensing devices and how they design the city and its imaginaries, one of our capacities as architects is to make them, thinking about all the layers in which they can challenge alternative readings of air quality. Because making visible or sensible environmental issues is a way to give them a voice, to allow them to participate, in our case, in design. So we don't need to wait for the perfect data, for the perfect sensor, but in fact, we need to multiply the ways of sensing, visualizing, and communicating the air. As Latour states in his beautiful book, Paris Ville Invisible, to increase their visions so that other aspects of the air and its relationship with humans, more than humans, and the public space can be accounted, can introduce other ways of getting to know the air, which is not only about quantities per cubic meter, but also smells, visibility, erosion, bodily nuances, or climate change. And other possibilities of engagement may come into place. So one of the challenges of In the Air has been to multiply the inscriptions. So we have this digital application, as I showed before, but also we started overlapping with maps that enable us to understand how the urban space is mobilized here, for example, relating to land price, or how the city can be navigated having these large displays of real-time environmental data. More recently, we have started the project called Pollen in the Air, which goes forward with a more than human perspective and puts the spectator within the pollen, floating in the air, as a bee or as a particle, a spora or a germ. In the attempt to understand the complex affective ecology, as Natasha Myers has framed it, that takes place in the environment. By doing this, we are also able to read the city by the plants' reproductive phases, where specific plants are located, and what type of plants the City Council of Gijón, for example, where this case study was developed, is sensing and taking care of. And we realize, for example, that it's only the monumental plants that are being registered and monitored, but all the ones that generate more pollen, for example, as all the bushes and less special or specific plants are not registered at all. This visualization is therefore a research technique that has enabled us to know a lot of what it takes to sense pollen, but also designs other ways of understanding pollen, out of health, alarmism, for example, and cultural accounts of pollution. Fourth design technique, reformulating public space towards queer urban political ecologies. And this comes from the effect of developing the previous techniques that I've been developing. Until now, we have seen that the urban space is designed and transformed in its visual, aesthetic, and symbolic terms by the presence of sensing infrastructures. However, there is a potential in thinking about the materiality not only of the area itself, but also of its sensing infrastructures. By acknowledging their political capacities of raising matters of concern and the problems that having them invisible pose to how we can think and enact towards them, maybe one way of opening up their political capacities is by making them visible and actionable. By doing so, other relationships between the built environment, nature, humans, and infrastructures could take place, constituting more symmetrical urban political ecologies. In India, we developed a prototype that intended to address this issue by bringing environmental data to the public space and make it public in a collective arena. But not only, it also intended to change how the public space is inhabited and perceived, generating a data vapor cloud that showed the levels of air quality by different codes, but also reduced the temperature, increased humidity, and sediments particles in suspension. It is a cloud that makes visible the air itself in its own materiality, in its own medium, and transforms urban space as a laboratory to test new configurations of political ecologies. And yet, researching DIY sensors, I found out that there is a potential to expand urban ecologies through a performative way of measuring that involves ephemeral or hybrid properties, as these temporary measures of air pollution in New York, challenging urban ecologies towards less legitimized urban spaces while operating through hacking or appropriation. So in this case, infrastructures are not there permanently designed and located by engineers and public institutions, but are hacking spaces identifying potential places for measuring and having political implications with the data all along the city. And then, to all these more temporary, blurred, and quick condition of understanding nature, monitoring, and the urban space, I wanted to think about how we can move towards a queer urban political ecologies. Last design technique. As architects, thinking from the air leaves us with many challenges that emerge out of the materiality and the properties of the air itself. On how to work with relational, invisible, and ever-changing and non-apprehensible material, on how to deal with the toxic, on how to live in pharmacon environments, and to deal with environmental justice. It also challenges or reframes our urban representations and forces us to engage with blurriness, where icons are not anymore objects or figures, as the Real Madrid towers in Madrid, for example, which were built to become figures, but they become the ground of air pollution. Through the constant use in the media to make visible air pollution, and all this comes out of the news, we can say that architecture is becoming the background of the air, and we could think about all these skyscrapers as actually sensor devices themselves that indicate through the visibility the levels of pollution. But then that raises lots of questions. Is tallness still a tool for urban representation? Do we need to find other representations that include the air? would that help to start thinking in how to live with toxic or pharmacal environments? And understanding the air as an ontologically indeterminate forces us to think on how to design with uncertainty somehow. And in this project, we try to test this condition of how to deal with and how to work and design with uncertainty. It was a project for a music festival where we had to construct the space for art and performances created by Ivanos and Nerea, where we decided to make and construct the space with helium and air. There were no specifications available on how helium and air performs at an architectural level, and less working with balloons. Because the weight or tension was not included in any specification, the assemblage process was not described in any single specification, or neither the producers had any clue on how to do this. So basically we had to do, in a trial and error process, trying to find which is the best way that all these balloons could be brought together, testing many different options, having all these students, because we developed it in a workshop with students of Alicante, but fighting against helium and air itself. Finding out that every morning we would go back, and then the balloons had completely destroyed all these domes and had showed their agency and capacities that we were not able to control. So we realized at the end that maybe instead of trying to control it and have a very, very strict outcome, as we had planned at the very beginning, what we decided was to get something that was as close as possible to what was needed for the art and performances, but nevertheless that could bring qualities of the art into the stage. So.
We have now some minutes, thank you, some minutes for the Oh, you sit here. They are going to here. So it's your turn. Who wants to begin?
So I wasn't sure exactly whether you invited me to be part of this because I spent the last 5 years in Los Angeles, a city known for its smog, or used to be known for its smog. First of all, I think it's really important. I think what you're doing is working with material behavior, new materialism. People use that expression. I think that's a very important theoretical agenda to deal with. I was highly influenced by the work of Manuel de Landa, who comes out of the Deleuzean perspective and looks at material behaviors. And I think that's absolutely essential to incorporate it within our theoretical register. And certainly, if you think about a place like Los Angeles, it is really born of materials in many ways. I mean, it's the light conditions in the first place that brought the film industry there. It was the way that they could get water there, they would pump it from the north. But that allowed LA to exist, and it's the kind of the removal of the smog to some extent. More recently, we do smog tests every year, right? That's allowed it to become more inhabitable. It's now become attracting a lot of people. It's become Silicon Beach, Venice Beach has become Silicon Beach. And you're even getting people, surprisingly, coming from Beijing and Shanghai because it's more healthy there, less smog than in Beijing and Shanghai. To think that actually LA can become a place where people go to escape the smog from elsewhere really shows that you can do something about the conditions. So my real question to you, in a sense, was that you make a comment at one point, we can't do anything about it, it's there. I mean, I think we can, and it's very clear how we can do certain things. But the really interesting issue I found was that the question of the Sainsbury's supermarket in Sheffield, where local resistance to it prevented it from happening. And I don't think that a supermarket per se is necessarily going to be good or bad, and one has to understand precisely what are the implications within a kind of ecology of the city in a broader spectrum. Just to build a building, I mean, obviously there are certain emissions from construction. What does it imply about having a supermarket in terms of patterns of behavior, of traveling, air pollution from cars and so on, to have a supermarket there rather than anywhere else? So I think almost I would say that, I mean, hacking is all very well, but I think one has to kind of like, really get to understand the architecture of pollution itself, and within a kind of a much broader framework to understand how we can overcome that. I think you also got a slight problem in the sense you're dealing with the invisible. We as architects always operate within the realm of the invisible. So your project for the helium balloons, which is kind of visualization of thing, is always going to be kind of compromised because you have to visualize in order to understand that logic. But I do think that there are ways of dealing with it, and I think one has to maybe sort of dig deeper to find out what it is. So my question for you is about that supermarket. What is bad about the supermarket, and how could one alleviate it? How could one think about that in a broader context? So not just stopping the supermarket construction, but thinking about what the implications are in a broader sense.
Well, first to clarify, because maybe, so to clarify on your first comment, I'm not saying that things cannot be done. Of course, can be done, but one of the difficulties is that many of the measures that are being deployed are not working as they expected. So what I'm trying to think is how, first of all, we can open up spaces, open up more spaces that are not only related to reducing emissions, for example, that we can try to reduce the levels and engage differently with air quality. But something that I think at a theoretical level is that we think about the Anthropocene, for example, like there's no, the world is polluted. And this is not to dramatize, but I just want to think that maybe instead of trying to have this ideal still of the clean and pristine environment that doesn't exist almost anywhere in the world, maybe if we face toxicity at a very direct level, maybe we can start thinking, of course, ways to reducing, but also ways of understanding, for example, environmental justice. which is not that toxicity happens in all places at the same time, at the same level, but there's some places that are highly polluted for certain reasons and not others. And maybe those are the ones that have more urgency for being addressed, and maybe others can still wait eventually, if it's a matter of urgency and doing things now. But of course things can be done, and that's for sure, and that's why in a way my research is trying to open up all those spaces to try to reduce them, but at many, many different levels. Not only from the scientific one of emissions reduction, which, because it doesn't seem to prove that it works at many levels or in many different contexts. But your question about the supermarket, what I think it's, what I found fascinating is that in a way they managed to operate in an urban planning negotiation and discussion by mobilizing air quality data. And the reason for that was that that area was already very, 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 very polluted, and they said, we cannot get any more pollution. So it's not about we don't want a supermarket. Supermarket is not good or bad in itself, but for the standards that we have already, they are so high that we cannot we cannot accept it here. It's gonna just raise them over levels that that are, of course, above the European limitations. So what I find interesting is that sometimes we think that these sensors and devices are only translators of something, but mobilizing in many different ways, they can also transform the city, as stopping a development is. So I'm not judging it. I just put it as a kind of example of how mobilizing these sensing devices can produce effects in the city.
Just a small follow-up. I mean, of course, the Beijing Olympics was they stopped all construction right before it, and then they had this principle that cars would go alternative days, not in even numbers. So, and by comparison, obviously last week the Beijing marathon happened, and it was incredibly smog-ridden. It seems to me that the number of different questions, like the supermarket per se, what emissions you get after it's built, but also the construction of everything. So I think the whole area needs to be interrogated to a deeper level. I mean, I think the strike per se is a little bit kind of simplistic.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks for the presentation. It was great. I don't really remember what I was. The second time I see you presenting is this one. The first one was 11 years ago when you visited my school in Medellin. And some of these ideas were there. There was a lot of design in that presentation, and it was less about the air and more about politics at that time. But I think for me, I'm making a very interesting connection, I guess also because, and this comes to my question, which is about design and what can we really do? Because I perceive that there are two lines of investigation, and I'm not sure if they should be necessarily so sharply separated. One is this idea that all these visualizations are coming up at a time in which interaction designers, graphic designers, artists are more or less on the same on the same track and the same kind of technological capacity and condition. But what will happen in a few years? And my question to you about more broadly about our agenda as architects, when we really will have to catch up with artists and interaction designers, because the work that we've been doing tends to stay on the representational aspect that its body is basically these visualizations that are usually seen through small bidimensional screens. So in my concrete question, I guess, is basically, what do you think is the future of this, about thinking about the air and designing in the air? Is it about these media facades and let's say the last 15 years of work? I think there's a very interesting Iberian lineage also to work in those lines. Or is it really about starting to think about the air as a way to really redefine the way that we think skylines? Let's say, for example, and I think that's extremely compelling when you mentioned the idea that the background is now the architecture, and basically the speakers will start to become more blurred, whether we want it or not. And I see that as a completely different theme than the media facades of the last 15 years.
Yeah, that's one of the. I think that's one of the objectives of my thesis, because I started with visualization, but then I said, okay, now what? I think there's not only one response. There's what would be interesting for me would be like multiplying inscriptions, devices, etc., to understand that each of them has a very specific way of engaging with certain public communities, has certain political capacities, etc. So I don't think would be one or the other one, but would be like trying to get as many as possible so that we can interfere. As Hannah would say, for example, that we can interfere in as many ways and realms as possible. So thinking about representation of the urban, but also thinking about what it means to have all these machines in the public space. Like, what do we do with them? Which doesn't mean, yeah, or whether media facades are eventually interesting tools to communicate equality, but in which terms, why, how, how do we think about that? But I think the role of architects, for example, is very interesting because as I have seen, for example, with other designers, is that we think about it from the city and from the architecture, and that's a very specific approach that can provide many fruitful projects.
An important question when you mentioned that the talks is a productive medium, but how it can really be the body of the outcome of an architect rather than thinking that the body of that is basically seen through a small screen, whether it's an iPhone or a computer.
The toxic?
Yes, or basically everything that is airborne, how to really give body to it, especially when you deal with light matter that is not inert. I'm speaking specifically about the pollen, which is basically operates at the scales that are so different from the ones that we tend to frame the visualization of this phenomenon.
Well, one interesting aspect of visualization I think is that we don't, if we exceed and expand the digital realm, we can find lots of ways in which either the air or pollen come into play through humans, for example, with asthma, with all these effects in the body, but also we can see how there's many natural indicators, for example, lichens, mosses, etc., that enable to see levels of pollution at many different levels in many different ways. So I think, of course, we have to try to move out of the digital, but the digital still has a certain capacities of interaction. And yeah, absolutely, the pollen started as trying to understand the overall ecosystem of the air, and then therefore there's gases, particles, but there's also pollen and there's disease. So in trying to understand how it works, one realizes that they operate at so massively different ways that they become like almost independent systems, but they react among themselves. Pollen reacts to particles and gases, and then it goes pulled out. So it's fascinating to understand like how they interact with each other and generate this ecosystem.
We have to go to another question. Patricia?
I was very interested by your point about the legitimization of existing practice, that there's new devices that would measure atmospheric pollution, where like that was the consequences of them. And my question is about like the human body as a device to make the invisible visible. And I'm wondering, from your design practice and design process, how does this device legitimize or question the aesthetic that we have today in architecture? And like how much do this like measurement of thing, of pollution or different particles in the atmosphere would like foster or forbid uncertainty within the design, like measurement versus uncertainty?
We have 5 minutes more.
Yes, one of the challenges and difficulties of putting at the same level scientific and non-scientific accounts of measuring, for example, is that ones give numbers and the others may not or don't provide these. So there's a whole debate on what each of these ways of measuring can do. Science says that only the technical ones can do things, but for example, smelling, it's becoming a practice that has been recognized by the European Union as a way of measuring in places where you cannot have technical devices. And then neighbors go and smell where there's a new development or whatever. And what is interesting is that these practices, on one hand, need to train the body to become sensitive enough, so they require certain levels of coordination or standards that can be compared. But then I think from design, instead of relying necessarily only on the numbers and saying, okay, for this project to be scientific, I only take the numbers from monitoring stations, maybe we can also use other ways of sensing that can give us other types of information of the environment or of the buildings that we're using. For example, there's this beautiful, 5 minutes, okay. There's beautiful accounts in history and sociology, for example, on how buildings, the chemicals of buildings, have produced diseases that are very difficult to identify because they cannot be recognized in the body. So that uncertainty is is the main issue on how to recognize that as an illness or not. And that changes not only the materiality of the buildings, but also changes whether these people can have medical care, etc., etc. So I think it's very interesting because it's at the core of that possibility of leveling.
Thank you, it was very interesting.
Well, usually we open this for questions and answers, but I think that we are in the limit and we don't want to get nervous all the coordinators that are around of first and third floor. I just want to say that we have heard today interesting words like new materialism or like architecture of pollution or environmental justice, which is I think is a very important part of your lecture because it has had a continuous political undertext in a way, and also you run political ecologies and values in this last question of our representative of the space, GSD, Patricia. And I want to thank you, all of you, and especially Nerea, for this very interesting class. Thank you so much.